Hey guys, in this workshop, I'd like to introduce you to another key component in the Intent Architect ecosystem, and that is the application settings. And the example I'm going to use today to show you guys how this works is something that you guys have probably already noticed, that every single time you run your application and you create data through the APIs, that data is essentially lost between sessions. And that's quite simply because we have an in-memory database provider and the data is just being stored in memory. So what I'm going to show you guys is how we can use the settings to switch ourselves out of an in-memory database and over to something that's a bit more persistent, like, for example, SQLite. So to get to our settings for the application, we can just right-click on the application itself, select the settings option, and this is going to open up the settings tab for this application. And here we start off with some basic settings, and these are things like the application name, its icon, which we can change, the description, and the relative output location. So this is the root of where our software factory executions will output to. So where the code base is essentially set to go. And this relative output location is relative to our to the folder in which our training.myshop.application config. So this metadata is stored. And so that's just something I'm pointing out, just in case you guys do want to change where the output location is for your projects. This is where you would essentially do that. Below this, we've got some other settings, API settings, AutoMapper, CQRS, and so on and so forth. These settings come in from the modules. So depending on the modules, we could have very, very different settings that'll come in here. So our architectures and our modules will determine what settings are available to us. And if we select any particular setting, we'll see the fields that are underneath that category. So these are essentially setting categories, if you'd rather think about them like that. Now we're looking for our database settings. So I'm going to just type in the search bar database, and it's going to filter out all the other settings and just focus us in on what database settings we have available. And here we can see that our database provider is an in-memory database provider, and I would like to change this over to SQLite. Now, one thing I could just mention is that if you have a SQL Server instance or a Postgres instance installed on your local machine, you're more than welcome to switch over to one of those instances. But I'm going to just, for the training purposes, I'm going to switch to SQLite just because that requires no extra infrastructure whatsoever and keeps things very simple. So switching to SQLite, say save, and we're going to rerun the software factory execution. And what this is going to do now is it's going to shift our infrastructure from this in-memory database provider over to the SQLite provider. And we can see that happen here inside of our infrastructure dependency injection, where you can see our DB context options are being set from in-memory database to the SQLite. We have a default connection string that's basically being passed in over here, and we can find that in the app settings.json. And there you can see that the default that Intent Architect has created is a training.myshop.db. Now, once we've applied this, you can, of course, head right over to the application settings, and you could change this to whatever you'd like. And of course, if you are using a SQL Server instance or a Postgres instance, you will want to change that to point to your instance so that this does, in fact, work at the end of the day. Okay, so let's come back to Intent Architect. We can apply our changes. And then the next thing we want to do is create some migrations. And we'll use Entity Framework's migration system to do this. And this is very much typical whenever you're creating a new schema of some sort. You do need to get that in sync with your underlying database. And Entity Framework has a fantastic migration system that we can use. Now, what you'll notice, by the way, is that there is already a migrations folder inside of our infrastructure project. And if we open this up, there is a readme.md, and this has been dropped off by the Entity Framework module. And what it has inside of it is just very, very useful instructions for creating migrations, just so that we don't have to go look the stuff up. It's all here and available to us. And the most important ones that we would typically use are to create new migrations. And then once we've created that migration, we would then update our schema to the latest. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this instruction. And I am going to be using the Visual Studio Package Manager to do this. By the way, just below here, you can see there are the CLI versions. If that's your preference, you're more than welcome to use the CLI version. Let's head over to the tools and to the Package Manager console. And I can paste this in here. I'm just going to rename our new migration to be called initial schema. And I'm going to say enter. This is going to build our application, and it's going to create our new migration. So just giving that a moment. Now, one thing, by the way, while this is running that I could just mention is a common question we sometimes get around migrations is, would it be possible for Intent Architect to create the migrations for you? And the answer is yes, absolutely. It could do that. But most of the time, there are such powerful tools available, like, for example, this entity framework migration tool, that are already very powerful, have a lot of different features and functionality, tried and tested, that it's usually not necessary to go and set up a module to automate the migrations. We typically use whatever tool the teams are most comfortable with to do that, because those are already quite comprehensive, powerful, and very good at what they do. So that's just something I could just mention there. We can also just circle back to our readme.md. We can now copy the update database instruction. I could paste it in here and say enter. And this is going to run this migration. And what it'll do for us is it will create our training.myshop.db over here for us. And that's because we've got a SQLite instance. Of course, if this was pointing to SQL Server or Postgres, it would create our database there with the migration or the schema up to date with our current data design. All right, guys. So at this point, we can run this application. I'm not going to do that, but you can go ahead and run it in your own time. You can go create additional products and customers and orders. And what you'll notice is between runs, that is now being persisted. I'll let you guys do that in your own time. I hope that this, number one, gave you guys a good introduction to the settings, as well as showing you guys how migrations can be done using, for example, the entity framework migration tool. Guys, hope you enjoyed it. Until the next one, cheers.